very excited to present this to you. One of our values at Ahava Media Group is always be learning, and we love putting these webinars together because it's really an opportunity for all of us to share best practices and figure out what's going on in the industry and what's working and maybe what isn't working so well. So really great to have this opportunity to share and hopefully get some fresh new ideas about physician marketing and how to market to your referring physicians and providers and other healthcare practitioners as well. It's funny, I was getting ready to do this webinar and somebody like messaged me on LinkedIn and she's like, we're trying to decide what to call the button. We're redesigning our site. Like, what do you think the best practice is? Like, we don't want to say doctors, particularly because that can get confusing for patients with find a doctor. And I said to her, I think really the best use is for healthcare practitioners or for healthcare professionals. And in doing the research on this, you know, I saw that a lot of people just put for professionals, which I thought was also interesting. If you're on a healthcare site, you know it's for healthcare professionals. All right, we look like we're getting critical mass here, so I'm going to get started. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you'd like to tweet about this, if you're still on Twitter, good for you. You can tag us at Ahava Media Group. Please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A box. You are on mute, just that's the default, but we would love to hear from you. We did have actually quite a number of questions come in through the registration, so hopefully I answered a lot of them, but if you have them at the end or even in the middle of the webinar, just go ahead and throw them in the chat box and Lacey will read them to me at the end. You will get an access of this recording, so you know, don't worry about that. You'll definitely get it along with a PDF of the slides that can help you. I quoted a lot of things and I put the sources at the bottom, so I want you to be able to access those primary sources. It is always so helpful to us when you give us topics for things that you are looking to learn about. It helps us schedule and figure out our own editorial calendar. So feel free if you have something that you're curious and you think that you know, we'd all love to learn about, please let us know. All right, so this is everyone's favorite problem, right? Everybody wants to write using jargon when they're talking to physicians. What is jargon really, and how can we combat its evilness within our healthcare organizations? So just a little bit about Ahava Media Group. If this is the first time you're here, I'm Ahava Leibtag. I'm the president. We are a copywriting and content marketing firm. We only do healthcare. It's all healthcare content all the time. My unofficial tagline is that we're making the healthcare web safer one word at a time. And we empower people to make the most important decisions of their lives. Unfortunately, I had a life-threatening illness, which turned into a chronic condition. And so I'm really passionate about the content that healthcare consumers read and digest and make decisions with. So again, copywriting, content strategy, and content training. If you find that your writers or your editorial staff or your entire digital marketing team needs a refresher, please reach out to us. We have full day and half day workshops. All right, that's enough about Ahava Media Group. Let's get started talking about what we're going to talk about today. So first, I'm going to do an intro because that's always fun, right? Set the context. Then we're going to talk about what real words for real people mean. We're going to talk about reducing friction, which I think is an incredibly important part of plain language and customer-centric writing and content. And then we're going to talk about stories and numeracy, and then everyone's favorite part, where you get to put me on the spot and ask me questions and hopefully get some good answers. So let's talk about basic things that all of us, if we're in healthcare marketing, have heard over and over again about what doctors and you know, subject matter experts want. They want exhaustive content, right? They want it all thrown at them. They're really smart. They're academics. They're well-trained. They're highly educated, right? Anytime you see the word highly, just cross it off. So is this really true that they want exhaustive content? Then there's this like fast content thing. They need to know what they need to know immediately, and you got to give it to them straight up so that they understand it. Got to have numbers and data, otherwise they're not going to believe it's true, right? What kind of numbers and data do you give them? And then do or do they not want stories? Like, are their brains primed for navigation? For navigation. Nobody's brain is primed for navigation, turns out. Are their brains primed for narrative? So I just wanted to give you data, some stats and figures about what doctors and stakeholders really do want. And this is from a report that was done by HealthLink. What kinds of content, what form of delivery solution actually, in this particular case, do doctors really want? Turns out everyone's favorite inbox, email seems to win. as well as professional conference exhibits. And then also it looks like in some level direct mail and somebody actually coming to the office is helpful. But I don't know, does anybody still use a fax machine? I don't know. This was a question that came through on registration. So see, turns out we do answer this, but is a doctor's favorite communication solution. Then the question we have to ask ourselves is, well, what's really going to work for them? So we did do a webinar on email marketing, and we can provide a link to that when we send out these slides and this recording. But basically, 7-word subject line have the highest click to open rate, which means people open it when it's 7 word subject lines. You want to use numbers in your subject lines because those seem to get a lot of interest. And then the subject line below that gives you like a little preview of what the email is about, you want to keep that to 43 characters. This was a study that was done by pharma about what healthcare practitioners want to see, but I think it's an interesting thing to know that this is basically what doctors are looking for. So if you look at the hot pink color, this is what they get, the received content. And if you look at the royal blue color, this is what they prefer. So they're getting tons of educational content about drugs and diseases. They don't really want that as much as they'd like to get patient materials, as much as they'd like to get samples, which obviously I don't think any of us have control over, although I'm sure some of us would like that. They want to receive new clinical data. And look at that below, that medical education. So they want to keep up with what they're doing, just like we talked about at the beginning. Our values always be learning. As digital marketers, changes every day, lucky us. So too medicine does as well, and they really want to keep educated and informed. Do they use patient education materials? So turns out that they do, and that's an important thing for us to know, that when we're marketing to them, if we show that we can provide them value in the things that they provide to their customers, patients, then they're going to be more likely to follow us, engage with us, consume our content. So that's an important thing to know about the fact that most of them really do use it. They don't just ignore it and don't use it for their own patients. And then what types of invitations for webinars? I don't know what a teleconference is. I guess that's like a phone thing. Or educational events, maybe that's like online learning. Are you willing to read and respond to? So again, a little bit more about how to get them to come to events. And obviously this email invitation with a website link to register is obviously the one that wins. So they are paying attention to those emails and they are paying attention to those webinars. One of the questions that we got was, how do we let them know what's available to them in terms of these networking, continuing medical education? And I would just say, put it in the subject line, like webinar, the name of the webinar, or what the value proposition of what the webinar, learn how to, or something like that. Because I think that that will grab their attention more than just some subject line, which doesn't indicate to them that when they open that email and they register, when they open the email, they'll get a link to register. This was a fun one. Actually, somebody just told me a story. They went into a doctor's office and they were describing their symptoms, and the doctor turned to his computer and started typing in the symptoms to see what was wrong with the patient, which I'm sure engendered great confidence in my friend, but actually didn't. Spoiler alert. So look at where they go. They are going to UpToDate, which is, clinical reference, but seems that they go to associations, their association sites. They look at PubMed for literature that's been peer reviewed. They might go to a medical journal website, and then they also seem to hit WebMD, which that's awesome. Listen, you don't learn everything you need to know in medical school. So, and then do they use social networking sites for professional purposes? Because if you're marketing to them, does it make sense to reach out to them on social media? Does it make sense to sponsor ads on LinkedIn or things like that? And we'll look around that. But 39% of them do use social media to communicate with physicians and other HCPs. Healthcare professionals as HCP. 54% do not use social media. I assume within a work context, the question was for professional purposes. If they don't use social media for professional purposes, do they use it for personal purposes? Unclear to know. And here is where they hang out. So turns out Facebook and Doximity are the places where they spend the most time for professional purposes. So there are a lot of people who would say, well, Facebook is only for, personal things or keeping up with friends. And it turns out that actually they may use Facebook as a way to correspond with colleagues or to find out new information. So don't shut down your Facebook marketing quite yet. And then obviously Doximity is the social networking site for doctors, and that's probably a place that they go to get relevant information as well as communicate with their colleagues. So speaking of Doximity, what does Doximity say valuable content is to physicians? What are they looking for? So current, right? We saw they want educational material and they want to keep up to date with things. So you really want to get them information that isn't too old. Otherwise, it's just the shelf life is gone and it's expired and they're not really going to engage or use it. Clinical, right? So they want clinical content. We're going to talk about exactly what that means and how you introduce them to clinical content. Tailored, so they want it to be relevant. So if they're looking at, more of a regional care area, then they're probably going to be looking for more information like that than opposed to maybe an academic medical physician who wants to keep abreast of national changes in healthcare. And then is it relevant to them, right? So a neurologist probably really doesn't want to learn about gastroenterology, although now there is kind of a connection between the mind gut, but you know what I'm trying to say, right? A podiatrist maybe doesn't want to learn about gastroenterology. So that's kind of a thing to think about, that you want to be targeted. You want to know who your audience is, and you want to know the things that are going to pull them in. This was a study that was done in 2019 by New York Presbyterian, where they were asking physicians, their referring providers, what are you looking for? 55% wanted innovations and breakthroughs. So that makes a lot of sense. Doctors want to get people well, and so if they can find new ways of doing things that are clinically proven to work, that's going to be information that's valuable to them. They also want to know any research that you're conducting in their specialty area, particularly I would think in the cases of neurology and cancer. Those are the kinds of things where they're going to want to know if they can send their patients in for clinical trials. And then outcomes data. So they do care, like, does this thing really work? Because if it doesn't, then they're probably not going to be that interested in pushing their patients toward that. So that's just, some data about what doctors are looking for, surveys that have been done in the last 2 years, getting information from them. I actually also looked at a study that I didn't bring in that was about, is there post-pandemic fatigue around emails from pharma? And what it turned out was that there was not. Doctors are still using email to communicate and to get information. And the best bet is for pharma is to send out emails monthly. That was the duration that they suggested. That was best practice. I personally think you should show up in somebody's email inbox at least every 2 weeks when you're talking about the kinds of marketing that we're doing. I think monthly works, but I also think that if you want them to be reminded about you on a regular basis, it probably makes sense. So you just have to work it out with your editorial strategy. I think once a month is fine too, but I think it really is for them to see your name every 2 weeks and for you to communicate things that are of value to them. So let's talk about what plain language is versus jargon, because there's a lot of misconception out there about this. And I think it's really good for us to sort of level the playing field and discuss as a community of practitioners what exactly it looks like when we're talking about jargon versus plain language. So I'm just going to give you some consumer statistics, just regular people. 9 out of 10 adults have difficulty using health information that is routinely available. Sorry about that. 14% of adults, this is 30 million Americans, so it's a little depressing, right, are unable to perform even the most basic literacy tasks. So that means reading a prescription, figuring out how to take a medication, getting ready for a procedure. They just don't really understand the words that they're being given. And then more than $230 billion a year in healthcare costs is associated with low adult literacy. I want to explain something here. People are reading off of a page and they're trying to understand something. A doctor or a healthcare professional has tried probably to communicate this information to them verbally as well. And so it's important for doctors to learn how to speak to patients in ways that they can understand. So that's an important thing for us to think about when we're talking to our stakeholders about jargon versus plain language is, how do you talk to a patient when they're sitting across a table from you, or you're sitting on the couch with them and you're giving them bad news? You're not going to use elevated terms. You're not going to use, medically relevant terms that you would use with another doctor because they won't understand that. And so what we're really looking to do, and I'm trying to rebrand plain language, I always joke around about this, but in the movie Mean Girls, when the girl's like, stop trying to make fetch happen, I'm always like, you know, stop trying to make patient-centric language happen, but it's gonna be my goal by the end of my career, people are gonna be saying patient-centered language instead of plain language. But let's look at it. So plain language actually is, can people find what they need, right? Can they search for it and actually get it? Are we using words that they are using themselves to find the information that they have, that they want? Can they understand it? Can they actually read it? Is it like on a page, chunked and bulleted with headlines so they can scan and find what they're looking for? And then can they actually use what they found and understood to move on? There's actually an adult, so remember, again, it's fine, I'll go back to the slide. It's find, understand, and use. So again, when you're talking to your doctors about jargon, it's a really important thing to remember to say to them, this is actually what patient-centric language is. It's not really about just reading what's on a page. It's about the entire process of finding information that can then help them make a decision. Now, this is adult learning theory, progressive disclosure. And what this says is that people only really can take in the information that they need at that moment in time, and they themselves decide the limit of what that information is. So a popular web writing tactic to adapt to this progressive disclosure adult learning theory is a bite, a snack, a meal. So give the person the amount of information that they need to make a decision about moving forward on their content journey. So let's take a look at how this works out for a regular consumer. This is the National Multiple Sclerosis Foundation. And you can see here that they do this, right? They give a bite, a snack, and a meal. So they're telling you, here's the overview, and you can sort of choose this menu based on what you're looking for and what you might be looking for next. Get ready for this, okay? Remember, this is for doctors, what I'm about to show you, okay? Effectiveness of acupuncture for MS, right? Check this out. Same exact thing, bite, snack, meal. Now, they want exhaustive content, Ahava. Yeah, actually turns out that they don't really want exhaustive content either, depending on what they're looking for. So if they're a community neurologist and they need information that's going to help them do their job better and be aware of what's going on, they need the abstract, they need the background. Are they going to read the full study? Sometimes they will and sometimes they won't. So this is a very effective strategy to deliver what they need to know as quickly as possible. And you should think about using this strategy, right? Here's the rest of so here's the introduction, and then here's the method and analysis. You should think about using this strategy when you're creating your own emails for them or your own web content for them. Give them what they need to know at the top. Again, they're human, right? They're not any different from any other kind of reader, and then allow them to decide how much more they want to learn. Here is another example. So this is from the Nature Reviews Clinical Oncology. I love what they do here. They give the abstract and then they just give them the key points. And they have this really nice menu over here on the right-hand side that allows you also to scroll down and figure out exactly where you want to be in the content. This is a question now about, do they really need plain language? So I showed you that, you know, we want to give them what they want quickly at the top and then allow them to move forward. But what about the actual words themselves? Do they need the words to be, you know, shorter sentences, easily findable, that kind of thing? So let's look at a study. Evidence-based marketing, friends. Okay, so they looked at lawyers, right? Kind of the same professional. And they asked them, they showed them different types of, excuse me, content, copy, and they asked them, what do you prefer? 80% of them preferred simpler content. I'm going to show you some examples of this. Active voice, you know, shorter sentences, but sometimes longer paragraphs to explain things better. And actually, the more educated a person was, the more they preferred what they call here clear English or clear language. So the hypothesis is that people who are highly educated are always dealing with words and concepts and ideas, and they have to do a lot of reading and writing. And so the simpler you can make things for them, the better off that they are. And so there's a couple of examples here that I want to show. Crocstar, which is an agency out of England, did this. If you look at this, these questions, right? If this breach continues, my client will immediately terminate this contract. You know what that means, right? Now, breach and terminate are higher level words, but if you're an attorney, you know what those words mean. But the second sentence, excuse me, let me just take a drink. I always make this joke, but I promise you it's water. Okay. If there is a continuation of this breach, my client will effect an immediate termination of this contract, right? So 14% of the people, who knows who these people are, enjoyed passive voice. The rest of the people are like, just tell it to me straight, right? I got to read a lot of things today. I want to understand exactly what it means. Now, this, of course, is for a colonoscopy because they had to make it the most embarrassing thing that you could read. But if you look at the shorter sentence, it's written in passive voice, and it's kind of gross the way that they describe it. In the second one, which 84% preferred, they made it active. So your medical provider will use a flexible lighted tube called a colonoscope to look at the inside lining of your colon, as opposed to a colonoscope will be inserted into your rectum and the inside lining of your colon will be carefully inspected. So you can see that professionals with a lot of educational degrees want it to be simple also. Now, here's the one thing that's a little bit different. When you have a shared vocabulary with a community of people, you can use shorthand to get there. So bird watchers have all types of terms that they use. I know this because I have a friend who's a bird watcher that I don't really understand. I'm not in that community, so I don't have that shared vocabulary with them. In the same way, doctors and healthcare professionals have that shared vocabulary. There's actually a really funny doctor on TikTok where he like reads out of medical records and it's just a bunch of acronyms and you have like no idea what he's talking about. But if he's reading it to another doctor or a nurse, they totally get it. So it's the same thing. When you're writing for them, you can use jargon, or what I like to call the shared vocabulary of that community. They know that supraventricular tachycardia is SVT. You don't have to spell that out for them every time. You can say hypertension with them. You don't have to say high blood pressure. But that doesn't mean that the way we write using clear language should change. You can use the big words, quote unquote, but you still need to use short sentences. You still need to use active voice, and you still need to remember that formula of can they find it, can they understand it, and can they use it to make a decision to move forward. So one of the things that I find is that plain language, the minute they hear that, they're like, oh, you're going to dumb it down. I don't want you to dumb it down, right? Well, not everything is for the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Smith. So you might want to use terms like plain language, clear communication, or customer-focused writing. And what the Nielsen-Norman Group says, which is the premier like UX research group or think tank, as it were, about user experience, is that what customer-centric writing is it doesn't require users to slow down, to reread their content, or to use their limited attention span. Remember, everybody's got one, right? The goldfish in the 9 seconds, to understand the meaning of your content. So this is a really important thing to remember. When we think about that, can they find it? Can they use it? Can they understand it? Once they're finding it and using it, if we're creating friction for them to slow down and we're making them reread it and we're asking them to sort of parse through and figure out exactly what you're saying, we're not doing anyone a service. So especially with doctors who are moving quickly and have to make decisions quickly, we want to make sure that they can read it and understand it. Again, that doesn't mean it shouldn't sound smart or elevated or crisp, but it means that we have to remember that they need to make the same decisions as everyone else, using as few words as possible, if possible. This is from Consult QD, it's Cleveland Clinic's Cite for doctors. And you can see here, this is clearly a research article that a doctor would want to read. Laser ablation for unilateral periventricular nodular heterotopia and drug-resistant epilepsy. I have no idea what this is about. This ain't for me. I'm not a neurologist. I'm not an epileptologist. I wouldn't know what this is. But look at some of the other posts that they put up. Focused ultrasound, current and future uses. This is for a podcast. A neuroradiologist and a functional neurosurgeon explain how focused ultrasound work, how it's been used to date, and new applications that are likely to be emerging. I can understand that, right? Again, probably for a high literacy reader, but if it's for a doctor, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. The Cleveland Clinic wants you to listen to the podcast, so they're telling you what the podcast is about in simple language. Reimagining the non-clinical healthcare workplace. The pandemic upended how we think about where work gets done. Now organizations need to look forward to what this means for the future. Again, simple, getting the doctor to open up the article and read it. Again, the language is appropriate for what the subject matter is. So if you're writing about research or outcomes, you're probably going to have to use only words that a doctor would understand. But you still should make the description easy for them so that they can get right to the content that they're looking for. This is from the Penn Medicine physician blog. Again, they do the same type of thing here. So you see here, May Penn Trauma reports feature beta blockade and traumatic brain, the lasting effects of traumatic injury, etc. In May 2022, publications from Penn Trauma reflected both the clinical concentrations and the practical realities of the region's busiest urban trauma department. Not getting super complicated, obviously the headline and the link are clearly research motivated, but the description is simple and in plain language. With follicular lymphoma indication, Chimera reduced, I don't know how you pronounce that, it's a drug, receives third FDA approval, first investigated at Penn Medicine. Chimera has been approved for the treatment of adult patients with relapsed or refractory follicular lymphoma after 2 or more lines of systemic therapy. So again, getting the idea to them as quickly as possible. Here, for aortic aneurysm evaluation, look beyond size, Penn team says. And again, these might be PR headlines, right? They may have just put them right through, but they're easier to read and it's easy to understand them. So that's what I think that we're looking for when we're thinking about plain language for physicians. We can use big words, we can use elevated language, but we want to make sure that they can get to information quickly. So today, we are going to explore together 3 things that I think you should be thinking about when you are creating marketing to physicians. 1, reduce friction. 2, tell stories. And 3, use data when appropriate to support decisions. Okay, how do we make our content clear? What does it mean to reduce friction? So what is the majority of the reason that a physician might be coming to your web properties? They're probably trying to refer a patient. They're trying to find out research. They're trying to find a way to stay in touch with you if you're doing interesting work that they might be interested in. So we're going to look at some examples of where hospitals got this right and kind of got it wrong. So this is MD Anderson. This is very easy to read. Referring provider team, my MD Anderson for physicians, International Center, second opinion pathology. Design is critical, right? In other words, when you think about it, we often talk about design and it unfortunately gets a lot of love. And obviously as a content person, I'm kind of a little resentful of that sometimes because obviously people are coming for the content, but they're married to each other. So if the content is not in a design that's easy for people to find what they're looking for, it ain't gonna work, right? So here's an example of where friction is reduced. You can find what you're looking for almost immediately. Here's another this is from the University of Washington. And they UW, that's what they call UW Health. And this is also a UW Medicine, sorry. They do a really great job, right? It's like refer a patient, call to action right there at the front, access patient records, connect with us, transfer a patient, get continuing education. They make it really easy to find what you're looking for. This is another health system. I couldn't believe it. I clicked on for healthcare providers. Now, granted, it's a large healthcare system across a wide geographic area. It made me set my location before I could get into the deeper content. That's creating friction. You don't want to do that, particularly for healthcare providers. The other thing to remember is it's not always the doctor coming to the site to find information. It could be office staff, it could be their assistants. And so if those people get friction, they're jumping. They're like, listen, doctor, it's too hard to get these people into this system. I'm giving up. So that's an important thing to remember as well. Again, New York Presbyterian, they have these amazing content sections, like really rich content for doctors based on their specialties. It's unbelievable how much information people can find. But let's say I wanted to follow them. So they have this gastroenterology advances newsletters, but I didn't see that. It was banner blindness to me. I have to way down in order to input my email address to get this email to me. And you can see that they have these back issues available in PDF format. Really important to remember, if you want to capture physicians into your lead funnel, you've got to give them an easy way to find out where they can follow you. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that just as important as that call to action is refer a patient, it's just as important to have a way for them to input their email address, since we know that they like email, in order to continue to get this information from you. This was another hospital where I went to sign up for their provider information newsletter, and I saw this and I thought, oh my gosh, talk about reducing friction. This is like creating extra friction. Do you know what I mean? In what country is your office located? Like, why on earth would I need to fill that out? That makes zero sense to me. So I think medical staff membership status, so they're adding in all these layers when they want people to follow them. It doesn't really make a lot of sense when you're trying to get your physicians to continue to have relationships with you. This is from Hopkins. So they do a really nice job with their clinical connections to getting doctors the information that they need really easily. And they also use these quick explanations of what things are. So I think that they're a sign of reducing friction, in the sense that the writing is clear and crisp and gets people where they want to go. I just wanted to pull up this New England Journal of Medicine to talk about friction, not just in the sense of design, but in writing as well. If you look at this, you can read every headline and understand what it's about. Viral evolution and the future of monoclonal antibodies. And if you read in this audio interview conducted on June 14th, I'm not sure why the date is important there, the editors are joined by structural biologist Jonathan Abraham. Again, communities of practice, structural biologists, you need to know what that means, but the language is easy to understand, to discuss the effects of viral evolution. So I just think it's interesting that here's this, like, the New England Journal of Medicine, right? Like, they all want to be like this. Show them content from the New England Journal of Medicine, right? Guys, they're using plain language also to introduce concepts to you. And again, that bite smack meal, explaining to them who is the audience for this information, and remembering again that the New England Journal of Medicine is speaking just to healthcare practitioners, and they are using plain language too. So if they're using it, you certainly can use it. This is from CHOP. So I wanted to just give this example because sometimes we get questions like, well, how do patients know if it's for doctors or for consumers? And like, what happens when they wander into the 4 healthcare professionals and they sort of get lost and they don't know where they are? So I just thought this was a really great example of this. So obviously, pediatricians are very concerned about COVID. The vaccine for 5 and under just got approved. So, and there's this new thing called MISC, which I think it's like a complication, an inflammatory complication from COVID. And obviously, like, pediatricians, hospitalists, pediatricians, community pediatricians, they're freaked out about this, right? Like, they might have to evaluate and identify a case of this. And when you click on the clinical pathway to understand how to manage this, you quickly find out that you're not the right audience for this. This is clearly for a doctor. So I definitely think there are grayer areas of content where it could be both for consumers and for physicians. But most of the time, I think when you're creating content, the way that we do it at Ahava Media Group is we think of it as like Legos, right? So some of the Legos do not belong in the consumer-facing content, but the basic ideas and structures can be the same. The actual writing is still in plain language, but obviously you're going to use those vocabularies of shared communities where doctors understand the shorthand and also, the longer words that identify the clinical issues and the disease states. Okay, I'm just going to take another drink. So how do we get doctors to remember things? Well, and be interested in our content, right? So it turns out that, just found out here. If they're human, they have brains, they have human brains, and their brains are primed for narrative. So why do people need stories? Like, think about it, you're going to remember the stories from this webinar maybe more than you might remember some of the things that I said. And what is that about? So stories help cognitive and social development. There's a reason that we tell our children fairy tales. There's a reason why we use stories to at bedtime. That's what the human brain, it wants. It wants a story. It wants to understand things through that way. Stories also help to build empathy, right? When you tell a story to somebody, they can see inside of another person and understand that they're not alone. It helps to translate cultural mores, right? So when we tell stories, we translate like what we're about and what we care about. Hopefully. Stories stick in our memories, like I said, and they can also help influence and inspire. You hear, you know, stories of other people who managed to do superhuman things, or they overcame adversity, and it makes you think, you know, maybe I can do that too, or, you know, just feeling good about potential. Why do doctors use stories? So again, they're very challenged. They have a lot going on. They have to keep track of a lot of things, especially, you know, with COVID. I think a lot of them are very burned out. You see, talk about the Great Resignation, see a lot of healthcare providers leaving clinical practice. So they use stories because it helps illustrate ideas for them. It helps them remember things. It gives them hypothesis training. So when you hear a story, and they say to them, what do you think was wrong with this patient? Or you do a differential with them, what it helps them to do is sharpen their own minds to understand, okay, if I see a patient like this, what are the clinical pathways that I run down in order to understand what's going on? Affirmation, right? So when they hear stories and they thought something, it affirms what they thought. And then low-level guidance for practice. So stories help them remember things that do help them then practice, change the way that they practice, or continue to practice in that way. So this was written quite a while ago, but this was an interesting thing where they didn't used to always use stories to teach doctors, and I'll just read this. This month, in an unusual move, the New England Journal of Medicine, our favorite, right? The field's bellwether, opened an issue with a case history involving a troubled mother, daughter, and grandson. The contributors write, data are important, of course, but numbers sometimes imply an order to what is happening that can be misleading. Stories are better at capturing a different type of big picture. So more and more stories have been brought into the way that we train doctors, for the reasons that I just described, which is that they're human and that's how they remember things, and that helps them. When I read this, actually, it reminded me at Aha Media Group, we have something we call a decision triangle. So every decision that you have to make should be backed at 3 different points. The first is data. Do you have numbers to support that? Do you also have common sense to support the decision? And then politics, because that does play into the role. And it was interesting. I was just talking to somebody on the Aha Media Group team about something, and I was like, we don't really have any numbers to support that. And she's like, conversations are data too, right? Finding out things from people is also, it may not be a hard statistic, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't add to proof points about why you may make a decision. And so this is kind of, see, that's a story you're going to remember now. So this is kind of the same thing here. Numbers are important, and we're going to find out doctors don't always interpret numbers properly. Numbers are important, but stories can also add to their data. This was a story that was published at the beginning of the pandemic about telemedicine, and it's just like story after story about treating telemedicine patients, not clinical pathways, not trying to impress upon doctors how to do video teleconferencing for medicine, but really just stories about how it can work and what the pitfalls might be. This is, again, they use these kind of stories to present cases and to understand what's going on. So this was a 48-year-old man with fatigue and leg swelling. Now, again, doctors love this kind of stuff because they'll read it and then they'll try to figure out what was really going on, how would I have handled it, what I would have done. They actually have like consumer stuff like this. Like I know the Washington Post also has this like medical mystery thing that comes out on Tuesday, like try to figure out how you would diagnose the person. Obviously, this is on a more elevated level. It's called a case challenge. They're trying to get doctors to sort of figure out what they would say. But again, stories are important. And so if you have stories in your practices and in your marketing, use them because they're going to attract physicians. Oh, when I found this one, I just loved it. Images in radiology, never feed birds in the hot tub, a case of bird fancier's lung. It's pretty great. A 50-year-old female non-smoker with a past medical history of rheumatoid arthritis and asthma presented to the pulmonology clinic with a chief complaint of acute on-chronic exertional dyspnea for 6 months. So yeah, that's a great story. Tip to the wise, don't ever feed birds in your hot tub. All right, so we learned about reducing friction, and now we learned about telling stories. Now let's learn how to use numbers to tell a story. So People are moving quickly. They need information fast. There's a great way to take data and put it into an infographic or a graphic in order to get these ideas across. So this was from Houston Healthcare about COVID hospitalizations, August 10th, 2021. You know right away it's probably better to get vaccinated if you don't want to end up in the ICU. Again, these kind of graphics are just as good for doctors as they are for regular lay people like the rest of us here. So important to think that when you have a large data set and you want to present it in a way that doctors will understand, like outcomes data, this comes in like with transplants when you're trying to get referring providers for transplants, or you want other transplant teams at smaller centers to, this is a great way to show them information as long as it's a clear graphic. This is also a really clear graphic about MS, right? So there's this whole theory that below the equator, above the equator, changes your risks of getting MS, shows it perfectly, right? You can just see the numbers right there as well as the graphic over the United States. And then here are risk factors. Like you can see there are 3 women and 1 man. So chances are if you're a woman, you have a more likely risk of getting MS. So now those were consumer graphics, but again, great way to tell a story using numbers and data without confusing people. Okay, this is a fun one. I don't know what the obsession is with like the colon, but basically they did a study to try to understand how much doctors really are able to interpret data and numbers. And so they did a survey where they asked doctors to look at a graph and figure out what the survival rate for rectal cancer would be. Of course, they had to pick rectal cancer. Based on this graph, could doctors interpret this data to understand what outcome and survival rates would be, right? So I look at this graph and I want to go into the corner and suck my thumb because I chose to be a writer because math was not my thing, numbers were not my thing. I don't like to interpret data. It scares me. Which is kind of ironic since I'm a content strategist. I've gotten over most parts of it. But if I looked at this chart, I would really be flummoxed, right? And you would think that a doctor would be able to interpret this chart. Well, guess what, friends? 50% of them could not figure it out, right? So what we found out is that doctors also have trouble with numeracy. They also have trouble interpreting data sometimes, and sometimes they really appreciate it when you do it for them. So we're going to learn a few rules about how to handle numbers when you're creating content for doctors to make it easy for them. And again, remember, when you make things easy for people, it makes them trust you and it makes them want to work with you and it makes them want to, patronize you. Not patronize like that way. Be referred to their patients. So let's talk about some of the ways that we can use numbers. The first is that we want to use comparisons that provide context. Okay, so you could talk about how many millions of miles away the Earth is from, how big the moon is in comparison to the Earth. But nobody really needs to know the exact diameter thing, like unless I guess you're like Sheldon on the Big Bang Theory. You can just say the moon is roughly 1/4 the size of Earth. Now all of a sudden you sort of have a mental picture in your mind. So if you want to give the actual real data, which I'm not saying you shouldn't, that's okay, but try to interpret it in the writing in a way that allows the reader to get it right away. Because again, doctors don't necessarily have the best numeracy. You don't ever want to make them question the data, so you always source and you want to put it loud and clear so that they understand that it's coming from a trustworthy news source. Again, with the infodemic, we really want to stick to I don't even know what that is anymore, honestly, but we want to stick to places where we know we're getting really great information from. So associations, top hospitals, .gov sites, things like that. We would hope that those would, from the top medical journals, those are things that doctors trust. Data can captivate people, right? So this was majority of engineers believe they will become millionaires. Gee, I wish I had been better at math. Maybe I would have become an engineer. So that's something that's really interesting. Like I would read that and be like, why? Why do they think they're going to be millionaires? Like, what do they do differently that the rest of us do? So that can also be something. If you want to use data to lead with a story, that's great, but make it captivating. Find a way, a hook that would interest a doctor or an HCP. Lead with the positive, right? So this is important, I think, really, even for doctors, especially in where they are right now in their headspace about practicing medicine. You can say 10% of patients will die. Probably better to lead with 90% of patients will live. Definitely puts more of a positive spin on things. And then you want to lead with the main takeaways. So this is a infographic that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. Again, well, like a lot of things coming at you at once, right? Maybe not the best design for what they were trying to get across. But if you look, it says 82% of mothers said they have breastfed in public, the barriers to breastfeeding, and then they lead you to the fuller article, but they posted this infographic on Twitter so that you could see it. So if you're going to present a lot of data in a lot of graphics, might be a good idea to introduce the main points or what you're trying to get across to the HCP so that they don't necessarily have to wade through it and understand it themselves. Now, obviously, they're gonna want longer pieces of, especially like we said, if they're research scientists or they're academic medical physicians, they are definitely going to want to look deeper at the science. They are probably going to want to see the way the study was conducted. So I'm not saying that information doesn't need to be in there, but again, going back to that, can they find it? Can they use it? And can they understand it? I think is really where we always want to be thinking, and that progressive disclosure. What do they really need to know at this moment in time? What's going to give them more information that's really useful to them? And then do we want to give them that meal that for them to sink their teeth into? They can decide to come back to it if the abstract and the key points weren't enough. So to sum up, human beings, yes, doctors are humans. They are looking for a reduction of friction, both in design and the way that content is written. Stories are going to captivate them, help them learn, help them remember, and keep them coming back for more, and provide them data that supports their decisions, but make sure that you explain that data in a way that they can easily comprehend it and get to it quickly. That is really what they are looking for. And now we will proceed with questions and answers. So I'm excited to hear what people would like to know about.
Thanks, Ahava. We have a lot of really great questions. The first one is, how necessary is it to create two sets of materials, one for consumers and one for providers?
Yeah, so I think I touched on that a little bit with the Lego piece, but I think it depends on what you're talking about and what it is. So for example, the clinical pathways thing about MISC or MISC, that's not the kind of thing that you need to create for consumers. But if you're talking about, let's say, transplant outcomes or cancer outcomes, it may make sense to do like an infographic that explains the outcomes for consumers that you can also use for doctors. But in the consumer case, you can just give them a link to the study, whereas with the doctors, you might want to give them more of an abstract, not just a link to the study, but actually explaining the way that it was done so that they understand where the outcomes data came from. So again, it always goes back to who is our audience and what do we think the most important piece of this content is for. Again, we always think about top of the funnel, middle of the funnel, bottom of the funnel. For consumers and doctors, the top of the funnel is going to be very different. The middle of the funnel may look a lot the same, and then the bottom of the funnel is really always about trust and that next step. And so we just want to make sure that all the things we talked about today to create that trust with them so that they'll fall through, well, not fall through the funnel, but engage with the brand.
Yeah, you touched on this as well, but wondering if you have any, background knowledge. Are there any specific content formats that work best for physicians? Obviously, they all need to be clear, but is it Q&As, infographics, fact sheets, blogs, or articles?
Yeah, this is a phenomenal question. So again, going back to what they need to know, I try to look for data on whether or not physicians watch video a lot. I think that you have to look at your own analytics data to know that. I think it depends on what you're talking about. What I always say is that you always want to have a source piece of content that's written just because it's the most findable and it's the most easily digestible. Once you have that, you want to build off other kinds of content that are going to help you. So I definitely think fact sheets are important. We know that physicians download data from associations, both for themselves and for consumers. So if you're looking for, like if you're writing, let's say for a neurologist or an epileptologist, I would go to some of the associations and look at what some of the content that they provide is, because that'll give you a clue on what they're really looking for. I also think that, you know, looking at if you have access to Doximity and looking at which articles are performing well can give you an idea of what they're doing. But I think they're like everybody. They're looking to digest information in a couple of different ways. And as long as you're providing that to them, I think that you have the best chance of appealing to them and getting them to engage with the content. But like I said, there always needs to be a source piece. My personal feeling is it should be written, and then you can build a whole hub and spoke of other kinds of content formats around it.
Great, thank you. There's quite a few questions on this topic, and you did touch on it, but maybe you could go into more depth. So the question is, how can we train or remind physicians that they need to look at content from a patient's point of view, meaning that we need clear, easy to understand content? And then the second question, which is very similar, is how do we push back on leadership and physician stakeholders when they want to add jargon to content? So more how to manage that relationship.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of great research here and there's a lot of great slides. So I would bring that data with you to your conversations with physicians. One of the things that we really believe is that you should do all your SEO keyword research before you go interview an SME, you know, a subject matter expert, and talk them through what exactly the keyword research shows, because that can really help solidify their thinking about things. So for example, very early on in my career, I was a writer and I went to a doctor who was a cardiovascular, he was a cardiologist, and we were talking about hypertension and high blood pressure. This is an example I use all the time. And I showed him, I wish you could see what Google Keyword Finder looked like then. I wish I had it. I showed him the difference between cardiology between high blood pressure and hypertension. And it was just so obvious what the difference was. And he was like, all right, well, then I guess we should call it high blood pressure. And I said to him, you know, we can call the page high blood pressure, but in the body copy, we can put parentheses hypertension. I also think physicians really respond well to audience, to helping them understand their audience. And I once had this academic, I'm going to tell you a story now. I once had this academic medical center pediatrician, I forget what she was, maybe hemonc, I don't really remember, but we're having this conversation. We were talking about the service line pages that we were writing for them. They were called Centers of Excellence at this particular hospital. And she, you know, wanted to write this content in a very elevated way. So I said to her, well, why exactly do you want to do that? Like, your patients are regular people. So she said, well, if my colleagues see it, you know, I want them to know that like what we do here is very elevated. So I said to her, okay, well, let me ask you a question. What happens if of yours moves to a different city? How do you find another doctor for them? So she said, well, it's a very small community of, you know, specialists. We all know each other. Like, we go to, you know, all these conferences together. Okay, well, let's say you don't know somebody in that area. What do you do? So she said, well, I would go to my association's website. You know, I would ask around. I said, okay, would you ever go to the center on that hospital's page to find out information about whether or not that patient should go there? She was like, no, point made. So I think that that's really, you just kind of have to give them enough rope to hang themselves. You have to walk them through the process of what really happens for people, what they land on a page, what they're looking for. And I think marketers today have so much data that we're actually kind of by it. So you have to figure out what's going to work for each doctor. But again, it's going back to the business goals of the piece. Like, what are we really trying to get patients to do when they land on this content? What are we trying to get the action to be at the end? What do we really want from them when they're reading this? And I think just sitting down and talking to doctors, and again, like I said, I mean, I made a joke about it, but like one of the things we say is we practice evidence-based marketing here in the same way that you practice evidence-based medicine. And so when you're saying to me, well, our outcomes data shows that we're the best transplant surgeons in this part of the country, well, I'm going to show outcomes data that, or search data that's going to show that you're using the wrong keywords to write your content. Why is that any different? It's the same thing. It's numbers and facts and figures to prove the idea. So I think you just have to kind of have the conversation with them, go slow and low. Doctors are like, their bark is worse than their bite most of the time. And when you come in and you're confident, not, in a cocky way, but in a like, let's talk about why we want to do it like this. And then the other thing that I would say is, again, the question was asked with jargon. My issue now is knowing about the shared communities of practice. Could you go back to a doctor and say, this jargon isn't appropriate for this audience, but it's appropriate for this audience. Let's use it where it's going to land with the audience that we're creating content for, rather than just using it to prove how smart we are. They know we're smart. We're doctors. I mean, most of them.
That's great. All right, another one for encouraging physician engagement. How do you, or do you have any recommendations for encouraging physician engagement or participation in health system initiatives?
Like, how do you get them to, can you just, I'm sorry, read it one more time?
Yeah, do you have any recommendations for encouraging physician engagement or participation in health system initiatives?
Yeah. And I guess monetary. Pay me. I think that that's relationship driven. So I think that that's not necessarily, so listen, the funnel can only get you so far. At some point you need a human conversation. And so I think that, trying to get I guess it depends on what the initiative is and what you're trying to get them to do. But I think at some point it's really about relationship building. So content can open the door and it can even get you an invitation in. And sometimes you can get the handshake. Let's see how far I can push this metaphor. But you're not going to get lunch with content. You know what I mean? Like, that's not probably going to happen. So I think that that's really your physician liaisons team, is to build these relationships with doctors or their office staff, or other HCPs, to try to get them to be interested. I see one more question about what sources do you recommend for finding keywords on SEO. So there's a lot of really great tools out there. Google Trends, just looking at Google actually and looking at what they suggest. Moz is available, Keyword Finder is available, MRush is available. So those are some really good tools out there to find SEO words and keywords. In terms of searching for physician data, again, you're going to want to look at maybe more scientifically accurate terms, and that's really going to help push physicians to searching for what they're looking for. But again, when you're writing the content and you want them to click on the content, you want to use short sentences, plain language, active voice to get them to engage with the content. So that's an important thing to remember. Again, if they can find it, that's fantastic. But if they can't understand it or it doesn't grab them, then they're not going to use it to make the decision you want them to make, which is to further engage with your brand. I think that's it, right, Lisa?
Yep, that's it.
All righty. Well, it was wonderful to have you all here today. Thank you so much for coming. It was great. Like I said, we're going to send out the slides and the recording and all that, and a link to the email marketing webinar so that you can definitely access that. But what I want to let you know is that I'm always available to you. So if you would like to email me or ask me further questions, I am more than happy. If I can't answer the question, I'll tell you hopefully where to go to find the answer, if there is indeed an answer. So thank you so much for being here, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody.